Hello, I'm Neil, and today I'm paddling past Alki Point, the landing site of the Denny Party, founders of Seattle. On today's paddle, we'll quickly glimpse the history of Alki Point and its lighthouse. In September 1851, John Low, Dennis Denny, the brother of Arthur Denny, and Lee Terry explored the Duwamish River area with Captain Robert Fay. They sought to establish a town site and settled on Alki Point. John Low then hired Dennis to remain on the claim with Terry, while Mr. Low returned to Portland to retrieve the Denny party families. While staying behind, Lee Terry and Dennis Denny laid the foundation for the first cabin. As a side note, you may wonder why this group was known as the Denny Party. Arthur Denny headed the wagon party departing Cherry Grove, Illinois, bound for Portland, Oregon. However, when the wagons arrived in Portland, Arthur Denny was ill, and his wife Mary Ann was about to give birth. Arthur's family remained in Portland while John Low and David Denny, Arthur's brother, headed to Puget Sound, scouting for a potential town site. And in another video, I must return to the Fuller Denny Party and Seattle history. However, for now, the short story about Alki Point is about the town's founding competition between Arthur Denny and the settlement that the Terry brothers desired. Arthur Denny became the founder of the larger village of Seattle, laying claim to the east shore of Elliott Bay at a site known as Pioneer Square. Eventually, people began to call the smaller village New York Alki, which in Chinook jargon is New York by and by. On November 5, 1851, the schooner Exact, sailed by Captain Folger, sailed from Portland with the families of Arthur Denny, John Low, C.D. Bourne, and William Bell and Charles Terry. 24 persons arrived at Alki Point on November 13th, including 12 adults and 12 children. In September 1851, members of the Denny Party settled the land. Charles Terry's land included Alki Point. The Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 accomplished Charles' land ownership. In 1857, Charles Terry sold it to Dr. David Maynard, who later sold his 320-acre farm for $450 to the farmers Hans Martin Hansen and his brother-in-law, Knud Olsen. Hansen and Olsen split the claim, and Hansen's portion included the point and future site of the lighthouse. According to legend, Hansen hung the first lantern to mark the hazardous Alki Shoals and the southern entrance to the Elliott Bay in the 1870s. In 1887, the U.S. Lighthouse Service replaced Hansen's lantern with a post lantern. Post lanterns were used at many locations until a permanent lighthouse could be built. Post lanterns had a drum-type lens that produced a bright fixed light and were mounted on the scaffolds. The wick lamp had a large tank encircling the top of the lens with enough fuel for 8 days. A lighthouse service tender delivered kerosene or coal oil to the beach every 6 months. Since it was the property of Hans Hansen, he was appointed as the official lightkeeper and was paid $15 a month. Each day, Hansen checked the fuel tank, cleaned the glass, trimmed the wicks, and make sure that the lamp was lit and extinguished appropriately. His son Edmund and his 6 daughters and his niece Linda Olsen assisted him. The old post lantern placed on Alki Point in 1887 by the Lighthouse Service is now on display at the Coast Guard Museum at Pier 36 in Seattle. In 1910, the newly created Bureau of Lighthouses finally received an appropriation from Congress to build the much-needed lighthouse on Alki Point. The U.S. Lighthouse Service purchased the 1.5-acre pie-shaped property at the tip of the point from Edmund Hansen, the son, for $9,999. Edmund's father, Hans Hansen, had passed away in 1900. And on April 1st, 1913, the new Alki Point Light Station was ready for operation. Now, it does surprise me of the price, $9,900, $1 off of $10,000 for 1.5 acres. At that time, 1910, those numbers surprised me, and I wish I knew more about how that became. And anyways, the lighthouse is a 37-foot tall octagonal concrete masonry tower with an attached fog signal building, and it resides on the most exposed part of the point. Two large houses for the lighthouse keepers and their families were available behind the lighthouse. During construction, they added approximately 7,000 yards of sand and gravel to protect the buildings in stormy weather and from heavy swells and high tides. During operations, the two lighthouse keepers kept constant vigils and alternate 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, and they each received a salary of $800 plus room and board for their families. The original Alki Point order Frenzel lens is displayed at the Admiralty Head Lighthouse at Fort Casey on Whidbey Island. On July 7, 1939, Congress eliminated the Bureau of Lighthouses, and the U.S. Lighthouses Service transferred the responsibility for lighthouses to the U.S. Coast Guard. The civilian lighthouse keepers were allowed to remain on the jobs until retirement and gradually replaced with Coast Guard personnel. The last civilian lighthouse keeper at Alki Point was Albert Anderson, who retired in September 1970. Mr. Anderson retired from 43 years of service and spent his last 20 years at Alki, and two Coast Guardsmen assisted him with operating and maintaining the facility. In 1962, the Alki Point Lighthouse was updated with an airway beacon like those used on airports, and the new beacon flashed every 5 seconds, was 6 times brighter than the Frenzel lens, and was visible for 15 nautical miles. Until the 1980s, all operations at the Alki Point Lighthouse were manual. Coast Guardsmen assigned to the station were standing 8-hour watches 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The airway beacon was turned on 1/2 hour before sunset and was turned off 1/2 hour after sunrise by the duty lighthouse keeper. In October 1984, the lighthouse operation was fully automated.